Hey guys, this is Rod Meldrum, the Book of Mormon evidence guy. I gotta say, the last 2 episodes have been amazing. This has by far been the most in-depth research and the treatise we've ever done on the subject of what Joseph knew about Book of Mormon geography. So this is coming up as the 3rd part of a 5-part series that we're about to just jump into. But if you haven't checked out the 2 previous videos that we've done with Jonathan Neville, you don't want to miss the discussion that we had on Zelf's Mound and how he was killed, and it was with an atlatl. If you don't know what that is, you're going to want to watch that. Also, what was in the stone box on the hill Cumorah? Was the sword of Laban in there? So in this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into where the hill Cumorah is actually located. And we have a ton of new information on the articles and the times and seasons that some have thought that shows that Joseph Smith was changing his mind about his earlier ideas about geography. Well, did Joseph Smith really change his mind? Well, we're going to show you evidence that he never did. So subscribe below and let's jump into it.
I'm only halfway through.
One where the record was actually deposited. But the thing is, that goes contrary to what the Book of Mormon itself claims, because it continually goes back to the same hill. Time and time again, they go back to this same hill because it is a sacred location. It is the sacred repository of their records. Here's Book of Mormon and Ether 15 and 11. Now Moroni is writing this. Listen to how he says this. And it came to pass that the army of Coriantumr did pitch their tents by the hill Ramah. And that's the same hill where my father Mormon did hide up the records unto the Lord, which were sacred. So see, even within the text of the Book of Mormon, it continually goes back to the same hill. There was never any indication at all that the Book of Mormon had more than one hill Cumorah, because they keep going back time and time again to the same hill. Now those who have said, well, he hid the records up in the hill Cumorah, but then later he put the records on the hill Cumorah, and they think that that is indicating 2 hills. The hill Cumorah is a glacial drumlin. It's not one that would be susceptible to natural caves or cavities in the hill, so it must have probably been a man-made cavity and then filled with the records. Where did Joseph Smith send missionaries? Unto the Lamanites.
Okay.
Doctrine and Covenants, section 54, verse 8, in June of 1831.
This is where my knowledge 15 years ago and our knowledge today is going to really show up here.
Yeah, for sure.
The origins of the Mesoamerican theories.
Yeah.
This is the best I could figure out at that point in time. So let's just watch this real quick and then we'll get into where it really happened.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The Lord commands Joseph Smith to send missionaries unto the Lamanites. And thus you, Newell Knight, shall take your journey into the regions westward unto the land of Missouri, unto the borders of the Lamanites. Now, I don't believe that the Lord is confused about where the Lamanites are located, and he told Joseph Smith to send the missionaries there. Joseph Smith then also sent missionaries all over. The Book of Mormon had just been published, and a lot of folks have wanted to know, well, what did Joseph Smith know about this geography, and why did we end up with so many people thinking that the Book of Mormon is in Central America? Well, some of the early brethren who were called to preach the gospel began to seek support for the claims of the Book of Mormon about large cities and so forth through a book by John Lloyd Stevens, and it was a New York Times best-selling book called Incidents of Travel in Central America, Caiaphas and Yucatan. This book was a 2-volume series that actually had for the first time engravings of these monumental ruins that are in Central America. And it became a tremendous hit in the United States at the time. This book, this 2-volume series, focused on the tremendous ruins of Central America, which were promoted by early brethren of the church as evidence for an assumed highly advanced civilization. Such grand evidences appeared to be lacking in the northern Native American cultures, who were looked upon as ignorant savages at the time. This is John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff, who were the editors of the Times and Seasons at this time, in an article called Ancient Ruins in 1844. At the time that the book, meaning the Book of Mormon, was translated, there was very little known about ruined cities and dilapidated buildings. The general presumption was that no people possessing more intelligence than our present race of Indians had ever inhabited this continent. and the accounts given in the Book of Mormon concerning large cities and civilized people having inhabited this land was generally disbelieved and pronounced a humbug. David Whitmer, one of the witnesses of the plates, had this to say. This was actually recorded in David Whitmer Interviews, a Restoration Witness by Lyndon W. Cook in 1991. When we were first, we meaning the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, were first told to publish our statement, we felt sure that the people would not believe it. For the Book of Mormon told of a people who were refined and dwelt in large cities. But the Lord told us that he would make it known to the people, and people should discover evidence of the truth of what is written in the book. John Taylor writes this. He says, we were then told that the inhabitants of this continent were and always had been a rude, barbarous race, uncouth, unlettered, and without civilization. But when they were told of the various relics that have been found indicative of civilization, intelligence, and learning, when they were told of the wealth, architecture, and splendor of ancient Mexico, when they could trace the fine delineations of the sculptor's chisel on the beautiful statue, the mysterious hieroglyphic, and the unknown character, they began to believe that a wise, powerful, intelligent, and scientific race had inhabited this continent. And I can just see the missionaries as they would go out and preach the gospel and give people the Book of Mormon to read. And they would read about these civilizations, these people who had writing and built large cities. And then they would go to the missionaries and say, wait a minute, are you talking about the savages? And going, well, where's the evidence for that? And so I think what we see here is that we see that the early brethren were very interested in demonstrating this highly advanced civilization that was assumed would be found, who were the Nephite people of the Book of Mormon. This is 1844 in the Times and Seasons. It says, Stevens, in his Incidents of Travel in Central America, has thrown in a flood of testimony, and from the following statements it is evident that the Book of Mormon does not give a more extensive account of large and populous cities than those discoveries now demonstrate to be even in existence. So they were using, the early brethren were using the Incidents of Travel in Central America to demonstrate what the Book of Mormon was thought to be saying about large civilizations. When recent developments proved beyond a doubt that there was ancient ruins in Central America, which in point of magnificence, beauty, strength, and architectural design would vie with any of the most splendid ruins on the Asiatic continent. See, these opinions of these early brethren began a romance with the exotic, almost irresistible notion that has focused the interests and imaginations of generations of Latter-day Saints thousands of miles from where Joseph Smith recovered the ancient record and indicated by his signed statements to have been in North America. Which leads to another very important question. Why would it even be assumed that the Nephites would have built majestic ruins? Dr. Hugh Nibley, this is in the Melchizedek Priesthood Manual of 1957, in an article he wrote called An Approach to the Book of Mormon, Looking for the Wrong Things. Book of Mormon archaeologists have often been disappointed in the past because they have consistently looked for the wrong things. Blinded by the gold of pharaohs and the mighty ruins of Babylon, Book of Mormon students have declared themselves not interested in the drab and commonplace remains of our lowly Indians. But in all the Book of Mormon, we look in vain for anything that promises majestic ruins. Why would we even think that we should be looking for majestic ruins? If you think about it for just a second, as I was pondering this, I was going, well, what do we have any precedence for such an idea? Well, if you take a look at the civilization, for example, of around the time of Egypt, you have the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Which one of those were God's people? The Hebrews. Which one of them built grand structures? The Egyptians. What about between the Romans and the Jews? Of course, the Jews were God's people, but who built grand structures? The Romans. In fact, if you look back in history, I can't think of any time when God's people were the ones that built grand structures. In fact, quite the opposite has been the case. Nephi writing this is 1 Nephi chapter 12, verse 18. And the large and spacious building which thy father saw is vain imaginations and the pride of the children of men. And of course, this would have been brought with them to the new world. Would righteous Nephites have built such a structure as you see here? So what are the origins of the Mesoamerican theories that have been proposed as Book of Mormon lands? I've been able to trace them back to several articles in the Times and Seasons, and then another individual by the name of John Bernheisel. Just a quick background on Brother Bernheisel. He was actually a bishop of the church in New York and a quite a close friend with the prophet Joseph Smith. And so we'll talk about each one of these Times and Seasons articles and a little bit about how they related to the establishment of Mesoamerica as a setting for the Book of Mormon. We have to follow this chronologically, and that's why I have this in a chronological format, starting from June 15th of 1842 with the Times and Seasons down to October 1st of 1842.
As always.
And
Should we
then
stop? Let's go ahead and stop that there, because this is again, this is 15 years ago.
Yeah, you did a great job.
Okay, but what I didn't know is the origins of where these articles were coming from.
Yeah.
And I was just doing with word print analysis and other things, and trying to figure these things out, which will make a lot more sense here once you explain what was really going on here, which I didn't know about, the smoking gun of Book of Mormon geography.
Okay.
So
do you want to finish this, or
let's go ahead and we'll finish through this, and then we'll go back and clean it all up.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, you did a good
was
job
actually
on this.
in 1841. Well, some of the challenges to these accounts, prior to this, on January the 28th of 1842, Joseph Smith received a revelation that the 12 apostles should be given responsibility for the Times and Seasons and manage the print shop. Joseph recorded thus: I received the following revelation to the 12 concerning the Times and Seasons, given January 28th, 1842. Revelation, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Joseph, go and say unto the 12, that it is my will to have them take in hand the editorial department of the Times and Seasons. Certainly Joseph Smith would have done exactly as the Lord indicated and turned over the responsibility for the Times and Seasons to the 12. A few months after that, then Joseph Smith is going to be writing some of the articles, and in the first edition of the Times and Seasons that he was the chief editor, this was Tuesday, March the 15th, 1842. He says, to subscribers, this paper commences my editorial career. I alone stand for it and shall do for all papers having my signature henceforward. One of the very interesting things that we find in the historical documents is that none of these editorials that indicate a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon were actually signed by Joseph Smith himself. The Times and Seasons, June 15th, 1842 edition.
Dave, you stop there for a second? Okay.
Okay, because earlier we talked about the Wentworth letter, which was also published in 1842. Mm-hmm. And I think it was in that March 1st edition.
Yeah.
And so when he made that statement that everything that he's responsible for everything he signs, at the bottom of the Wentworth letter has a signature. Why
would he feel like the need to say that?
Probably because he wasn't involved with the Times and Seasons. But well,
exactly.
There's a couple things here that are interesting. I guess it's a good time to present this.
Yeah.
So that revelation for the 12 to take over the Times and Seasons. Do you know who was running or was working at the Times and Seasons before that? Was a guy named Benjamin Winchester. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give a little background on Benjamin Winchester.
Yeah, who was he?
He was member of the church. He had been the youngest adult. He was, I think, 15 during Zion's camp. Yeah. And he accompanied his father. And he stayed behind in Missouri, and they built bricks for that mansion and all that. And there's a monument in near the Liberty Jail out there. Is that where it is? Yeah. Where there's, it's in Missouri where they have the monument for the people who stayed behind.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And he's listed on there along with his father and Wilford Woodruff. So he was real close with the early brethren. And when he went back
his
to
dad
Kirtland,
was personal friends with the prophet.
oh yeah, well, so was Benjamin.
I mean, the prophet would come and stay in their house and so forth
Exactly.
with them.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were pretty tight.
That's right. And when they went back to Kirtland, he was ordained as 70. So here he was as one of the Zion's Camp people. He was a 70, and then he was based out of Philadelphia.
And he's like 18 or 20 years old or something like that.
Yeah, he was very young to be one of the
yeah.
70s. And he moved to Philadelphia, and he was real frustrated because he was always trying to be a missionary, but the
he was
newspapers.
zealot. I mean,
he was very
baptized over 200 people.
well, and he went on a
in his
mission
life.
with Orson Pratt and with some of the other early brethren.
Yeah.
And so, but he was frustrated with the newspapers out there because they were always publishing anti-Mormon stuff, and he would write letters to the editor and articles, and they wouldn't publish them. So he started his own newspaper called the Gospel Reflector, and you actually have a book here.
Yeah.
January
My
of
copy of that right there.
1841 to June of 1841. For those months, he published a newspaper called the Gospel Reflector, and
So this is all before this is happening here.
This is before.
On the video.
This is
that's all the
1841.
times and seasons stuff was in 1842.
Right. So
Yeah.
he was publishing this Gospel Reflector in 1841. And one of his early editions, I think it was in March, he wanted to publish Oliver Cowdery's 8 letters. And he asked Joseph Smith if he could do that, because by then Oliver Cowdery had been excommunicated. And Joseph Smith said, yeah, go ahead and publish those letters. We think you should. Mm-hmm. And Sidney Rigdon also said, yeah, definitely publish the letters. And it was also in 1841, about the same time, that Parley Pratt published those 8 letters in the Millennial Star in England. And so, so Benjamin Winchester published this newspaper, but it wasn't doing that well financially.
How many of you have ever heard of the Gospel Reflector before?
Probably not many. Here's the book again. But it was.
Hopefully this will be something brand new for you.
Yeah, it turned out to be a very influential newspaper.
Yes.
Because Winchester was very prolific in writing. He was writing a concordance of the scriptures for missionaries, where it would show biblical passages and how they related to the Book of Mormon and the Revelations and the Doctrine and Covenants. He was the first one to do that concordance. He wrote a book called The History of the Priesthood, where he went through the whole history of the priesthood, and even John Taylor said that was an awesome book. And so he was very talented as a writer. Yeah. And most of the editorials and articles he wrote. And he would send them out to Nauvoo, because the publisher of the Times and Seasons in 1841 was Joseph's brother, Don Carlos. Mm-hmm. And Winchester would send articles to him, and Don Carlos would just publish them, but they were anonymous. They weren't identified as Benjamin Winchester, but they were just published, like, I don't remember all the titles of them, but let's say one was History of the Priesthood. And so they would publish History of the Priesthood in just an article with no attribution. Well, then in the fall, Don Carlos died.
People just kind of assumed it was always Joseph Smith because it was his name on the boilerplate.
No, that didn't start till 1842.
Okay.
But it didn't even say editor. It said nothing.
Okay.
But so Don Carlos basically needed content to fill the paper, and Winchester was supplying it, right? And so Don Carlos died in the fall, and when Winchester heard about it, he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith and said,
he was working on the Times and Seasons. Actually, I guess he contracted something while he was there on Bain and.
Well, that's what happened eventually.
Yeah.
But so after Don Carlos died,
right,
Winchester wrote a letter to Joseph Smith and said, "Well, I'm so sorry to hear he died. I wonder how what are you going to do the newspaper?
Who could take his shoes?
Yeah, who could fill his shoes? I could." So Winchester moved out there in, I think it was in October. It was about the same time Wilford Woodruff came back with this Stevens book that you mentioned earlier.
That letter is still extant too, isn't it?
That
letter.
Yeah, you can read it in Joseph
from Benjamin
papers.
Winchester and so forth to Joseph Smith and said, "Man, who could possibly
replace him?" Well, so he arrived in October, about the same time Wilford Woodruff did. And Wilford Woodruff in his journal wrote that Joseph chastised Benjamin Winchester worse than he'd ever heard before. And we don't know what that was all about. But from then on, from October until about January, Winchester was working at the Times and Seasons. And he was publishing his own articles again, like Don Carlos had been. Uh-huh. And then, I don't know if I think it was Brigham Young who had a real problem with Benjamin Winchester. and he basically kicked him out of Nauvoo, and he had to go back to Philadelphia. And that's when Joseph received the revelation to have the Quorum of the 12 take over the times and seasons. And so this is all.
So now the Times and Seasons lost another editor, so they needed somebody.
Yeah, they needed content.
And they needed content. They needed somebody to actually do the work, because Joseph was too busy to actually go in there, and he wasn't setting the type and doing all those kinds of things.
Well, and at the same time, William Smith was there. See, Don Carlos had wanted to start a new newspaper for local Nauvoo issues, but he was unsuccessful. So William Smith, his brother, Joseph's younger brother, started a newspaper that he called The Wasp. And I think it was around in March. I'd have to look it up.
Yeah.
But it was the Nauvoo Wasp, so it was just called The Wasp.
So what does a wasp normally do? I mean, it's kind of
it stings. and William Smith was very garrulous. He liked to fight. He had a reputation for beating up Joseph Smith. They had a fight.
He and Joseph had some altercations a couple different times.
And so he became the editor of The Wasp.
Yeah.
But it was published in the same print shop as the Times and Seasons
there in Nauvoo.
Yeah, and so that's to set this all up. Plus, William Smith and Winchester had been friends, and they knew each other.
Now, there was something else in your book, though, that you mentioned about how Winchester was involved in a series of debates in Philadelphia.
Yeah, that was later in 1842.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that may have
in Boston and
kind of helped to spur him on to this Mesoamerica idea.
Yeah, well, right in this Gospel Reflector, he talked about the ruins in Central America, and he said there's a new course of dealing, he called it, where they could use the ruins in Central America to promote the Book of Mormon, and this was just before the Stevens book came out. But he actually visited Bernheisel in New York before Bernheisel got those books. And we don't know if he got them from Winchester or Winchester just told him about them. But he visited Bernheisel. Bernheisel got the books, gave them to Wilford Woodruff. Woodruff took them out to Nauvoo. Yeah. And that's where you're getting into these articles.
Yeah, which by the way, I actually went to the Hellerby Lee Library in BYU and actually was able to hold in my hands the actual journal of Wilford Woodruff.
Oh, yeah.
As he was traveling down the canal, basically, right? The
Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal, yeah. As he was heading back from his mission, and he stopped in and met with Bernheisel, got the books. He was bringing them to Joseph, and he's reading the books while the gift.
Yeah, that's right.
He's reading the gift as he's going to give to Joseph when he gets to back to Nauvoo, and he seems very, very enamored.
Oh, he loved it.
With these the Stevens books.
Yeah, he read those books. He read a lot of history books.
Yeah.
But he really liked these. He wrote about them in his journal. And the journal is available now on the church history website, his entire journal.
Pretty cool to actually hold that journal in your hands and know that he was actually the one writing it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, when I did this research, it wasn't available. I had to get there's a transcript of it that I used. And I did get some of the original writing out of it, but now anybody can go on the internet and read all this stuff for themselves.
Right there,
yeah, it's awesome.
It's a beautiful, beautiful time to live.
It is.
You can go back and verify it.
15 years ago, we didn't know all this stuff, right?
That's right. I didn't know any of this stuff.
That's right, yeah.
I didn't know who Benjamin Winchester was.
Yeah, hardly anybody does.
Until you brought that out with the whole Gospel Reflector. But what was it? So there was a phrase, though, I remember there was a phrase that tipped you off about some of these articles.
Yeah, what was that phrase?
Well, it's right here.
No man can hinder or something?
Yeah.
It's the title of his
title.
Yeah, that's right.
Was
at the masthead of his newspaper.
Yeah, the masthead of his newspaper was right here.
I forgot about that.
I see that, but basically it's right there.
Yeah, it says, "When God works, who can hinder?" That was at the title of the masthead of his newspaper.
Which is a rather unique phrase.
It is, yeah. When God works, who can hinder? And that was one of the things that tipped me off. Yeah, you're right. Well, let me just back up a little bit. I don't want to talk too long.
He knows so much, but he doesn't remember all the stuff he knows.
Well,
no, you do. I have to just say, just for me personally, I have never met somebody who can read as much material as you do and remember it. And know where you found it and be able to even quote it. I mean, you have an incredible memory.
It just fits, kind of in there somewhere. but this is interesting because remember we talked about when I went on the tour with you and Wayne.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how did we get in Central America? And earlier in our discussion here I said we get to that? Yeah. This is where we get to that. Because what you told me was, well, it's these darn articles in the Times and Seasons. Yeah. And that's what caused
to
this
the best of my understanding, that's, and actually, I got that because I had talked to some people who are big Mesoamerican believers, and they said, well, it's right there in the Times and Seasons. Yeah. And so that's when I started to really study the Times and Seasons and try to find, okay, so what did they say? And when I read it, I'm like, whoa, yeah, that's it could be pretty damning. And then as I started to kind of dissect it a little bit, I said, well, wait a minute. And you'll see this when I talk about the singular versus plural and so forth. How that may
but what you point out here
was tipping me off, but I had still no idea about all this background with Winchester.
Well, what you pointed out in the video, and we'll see, is that none of these editorials were signed by Joseph Smith.
Exactly.
And so, and that's one point.
And that was my stickling point. That was the one ace in the hole that I had.
But the thing that after I had that conversation with you, I was curious about who wrote these. It shouldn't be that hard to figure out, right?
Yeah.
And so I approached it as a legal case, essentially, looking at the evidence and all that. And I came across an article by Matt Roper, where he had done this stylometry, and he had said, well, there's only 3 possible authors for these articles, and it was John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph Smith. And he had this little 3-dimensional map of their word print.
Yeah.
And then it had their writings in these 3 areas.
Into the different
with different colors.
Different people,
And then he had these articles off in the corner. And I looked at that and I said, well, that tells me none of those 3 wrote that. And I said, well, that seems pretty obvious, that none of those 3 were, so there had to be another candidate.
But those were the ones that were recognized as being editors at the time.
That was the tradition.
Joseph Smith, John Taylor, and Wilford Woodruff. Those were the 3 that kind of were the contributors primarily, and that's what was understood.
Yeah.
But there was a secret thing going on.
Yeah. There was, and they,
tell us about that.
Well, this is where I don't, I can't remember where I first heard of Benjamin Winchester, but I think it was. Actually, I don't remember where it was. I'd have to. It's been like.
I think this is the first time I've ever seen you not remember something.
I don't remember where. Well, I remember that. I remember what I uncovered, but I don't remember how I first came across Winchester. It might have been that he donated books to the Nauvoo Library.
That might have been it.
It might have been that. There's a few little things, but he was not a well-known character in church history at all. And so this "who can hinder" thing, I noticed his gospel reflector where it said, "When God works, who can hinder?" And that basically that phrase shows up in these articles. Yeah. And that was one of the connections. And then so I started researching Benjamin Winchester. When I found in here he was talking about the ruins in Mesoamerica as evidence from the Book of Mormon.
2 years before these articles came out in the Times and Seasons.
And then, this Lost City of Zarahemla book that I wrote. In fact, let's look at that for a sec. So the first book I ever did was called The Lost City of Zarahemla.
Well, this was the first one.
Well, a church book.
Yeah.
I wasn't a church book.
True.
This was the first one. And in here I itemized some of these unattributed articles that had been in the Times and Seasons. And it turned out that Benjamin Winchester contributed more to the Times and Seasons than anyone else other than Joseph Smith, arguably.
Yeah.
And I had never heard of the guy. And so
where is he? So by the way, so this is these right here. You want to hold a few of those up? So this is
these are bound copies of the Times and
Seasons.
Of
the Times and Seasons. Okay, so this is the whole thing. You can see is an original typeset and everything else like that. This and is my whole set of Times and Seasons. Yeah. This is what I was studying from.
Right, me too.
When I was doing this.
And I was too.
Yeah.
And now, if you have Word Cruncher program, the entire Times and Seasons is in there. So easy to do research now. Yeah. But even back, you did this before I got involved, and then even
before this was digitized.
Yeah. And when I got involved, I was reading through those as well.
Yeah.
And so once I realized Winchester had contributed all this unattributed material, I took another look at these articles, and remembering Roper's article about how this was way out here.
Yeah.
That it wasn't Joseph or Wilford Woodruff or John Taylor.
But wasn't Roper's conclusion, though, that it was probably Joseph? That
well,
he
figured
was the closest?
Given those 3 people, Joseph was the closest.
Right.
And so I went to Roper. This is a long narrative. I went to Roper and I told him about this.
I mentioned that we were going to go in depth, right?
Yeah, so we will go.
This is about as in depth as you're ever going to see anywhere in the church today on this subject.
That's probably true.
On what Joseph Smith knew about geography. I hope that this goes viral and everybody in the church ends up seeing this video and realizing what Joseph Smith really did know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I went to Matt Roper, and I had an early version of this, and I said...
By the way, he's a really nice guy.
He's a great guy.
In fact, he came to my son's funeral.
Yeah.
It was really sweet of
Oh,
him.
he's a wonderful guy.
I'll never forget that, Matt. So
Yeah.
Thumbs up for you, brother.
And so, but I took it to him, and I said, why don't we do stylometry on Benjamin Winchester? Because it looks to me like he wrote this stuff. And he agreed, and I had an associate who was actual Roper's kind of a hobby stylometry guy,
Yeah.
but this guy did it for a living.
Yeah.
In fact, he sold the company to Symantec because he was doing word print analysis on the internet. And I tried to connect the two, and Matt refused to work with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, well, okay. But now it's a lot easier to do stylometry with AI.
Yeah, with AI you can do a lot of things.
It's a really interesting topic we could go over someday.
That would be
But anyway, the
interesting.
point is that
Yeah.
Roper objected because he had written articles about Mesoamerica based on these articles. And he ended up writing critical articles of me and the interpreter. We did a seminar together at the Mormon, or at the John Whitmer,
Yeah.
where he was criticizing me, and I kept talking about Joseph Smith as the nominal editor, which means not the actual editor, but just the named editor.
Yeah.
And he actually had a slip of tongue and called Joseph Smith the nominal editor too. But anyway, so the point is that
Well,
it
was true.
yeah, it was. He was
Yeah,
a nominal
he
editor.
wasn't the primary editor.
Just like he was a nominal printer. He didn't
Yeah.
actually set the type, as you
Right.
point out here. And so, but when I wrote this book, Roper had some pretty good criticisms of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went through and I made the changes. And I said, actually, Matt, you helped
That's
me
what
out.
peer review is all about.
Yeah,
Really, real
Yeah.
peer review is to show the weaknesses in your argument,
Right.
and so that you can either
That's right.
A, sharpen them, or realize that you're
that's right.
up in
Yeah.
the night.
And so thanks to Matt,
Yeah.
I did a second edition where I incorporated his criticism. I changed a few things, and he gave me some ideas that reinforced my own bias. But what he didn't know is I had reams of other material that my publisher said you can't do more than 350 pages.
Right.
This one ended up about 350. So I had
It's like
enough.
people don't watch more than 20 minutes of video.
Yeah, that's right. So they turned this off a long time ago.
So if you're still with us after all this time, consider yourself one of the top 1%ers
Yeah.
of people who want to know the truth,
Okay, so but I
willing to
had
dig deep for
I
us.
had enough material for 2 more books on this topic. So one of the books I did was called Brought to Light. And this is a book about Benjamin Winchester with a lot more detail on his background to support why he would have been the one to write these editorials. And then I did a third one called The Editors, because Joseph, William, and Don Carlos, all at different times of their lives, acted as editors. So I call it the Nauvoo trilogy, because we don't have the other one here, but there's
Which
3
is
books.
why we have the Nauvoo shirts
The
on.
Nauvoo shirts.
Nauvoo shirt, Nauvoo trilogy.
And
going
so
on
that
here,
was my
yes.
first foray into church history. And what I concluded was that Benjamin Winchester was not only a very prolific author, and he was very influential. As I mentioned, John Taylor recommended his book on history of the priesthood. He was writing books at the same time as these editorials appeared in the Times and Seasons. And I thought, well, how would it be possible for Winchester to get his articles about Mesoamerica
And have no attribution.
And he didn't live out there. So
Yeah.
how would he get there? And I found some instances of him sending stuff to
William.
Nauvoo to William, but from Pennsylvania, where he was living in Philadelphia.
Oh.
And so I
Some letters or
realized,
something that's still,
yeah, well,
still
there's
around.
There's 2, well, not letters, but just material. And
Okay.
so William Smith, remember, he was publishing the Wasp
Yes.
on the same printing press. And there were times when the Wasp and the Times and Seasons were publishing the same articles. And I realized, well, wait a minute, that means William Smith was probably editing the Times and Seasons.
That's
And remember, the Revelation told the Quorum of the 12 to be the editorial people.
to take over
William
that
Smith
responsibility.
he was one of the apostles. So
Yeah.
it was consistent with that revelation for William Smith to be doing it. And it was actually inconsistent with the revelation for Joseph Smith to be editing, because it was supposed to be the Quorum of the 12, right?
Yeah, and he said that he was only going to be responsible for those articles having his name
Right.
attached to it
Exactly.
henceforward.
And even though the boilerplate said it was published by Joseph Smith, edited, published, and printed by Joseph Smith, it was the 12 who had the editorial responsibility. And whether that was Wilford Woodruff or John Taylor or William Smith. We don't know for sure, but the evidence is that it was William Smith. And later W. Phelps came into town and was helping with the editorials as well. And that's a whole nother long conversation. But the point is that there was Winchester had an established practice with Don Carlos and later with William to send content out to Nauvoo to be published in the Times and Seasons without attribution. And so when these articles that you're going to be looking at here were published and it just said editor on it, that was not signed by Joseph Smith.
Right.
And so who was
and
it?
you'll see that coming up because there was some editions where there was articles that were signed by Joseph Smith
That's right.
and some by E.D. If it was Joseph Smith doing all of it, it would have been his name all over it.
Well, and plus, in these books, I pointed out there were a couple of times when Joseph Smith would buy the newspaper after it was printed and be surprised about what was in there.
that was a revelation to me.
Wasn't that amazing?
There, even a couple of things that were wasn't there a time when there was some kid had snuck into the Times and Seasons and changed something?
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. But that's readers should read the books about that.
It's just fascinating.
And another example is in History of Joseph Smith that was now in the Pearl of Great Price.
Yeah.
It was first published during this 1842 time period, and in there it said it was Nephi who first came to Joseph Smith. And we know it was Moroni, we know that. Oliver Cowdery had explained years before that it was Moroni.
Right.
So it was Joseph's scribes who made an error, and Joseph, as the supposed editor, didn't even catch it. And it caused all kinds of consternation. You have the anti-Mormons saying, well, the story is false.
Joseph Smith can't even get his story
right. Yeah, right. But it's interesting why the scribes would have thought it was Nephi. And this comes back to that story of David Whitmer and the messenger taking the plates to Cumorah.
Yeah. Because
we didn't finish this part of the story, but when that messenger showed up in Fayette with the plates, so that Joseph could translate. We know, by the way, I should mention, we know that Joseph Smith translated the plates of Nephi because the scribes were John and Christian Whitmer as well as Oliver Cowdery. And John and Christian Whitmer only lived in Fayette. They never went to Harmony. Right. So some people may not be aware that the Book of Mormon as we have today is not in the order it was translated. The first part was translated last. So First Nephi through Words of Mormon was the last part translated, and that was all done up in Fayette. Well, the messenger who went to Cumorah to the repository looked around, found the plates of Nephi, just like Mormon had done, the small plates, they call them. He brought those over to Fayette. And one famous incident is he showed those to Mary Whitmer, David's mother.
Right.
And Mary actually said that he introduced himself as Brother Nephi. And we know that of the 12 the 12 disciples, 3 were designated to survive, to live forever.
Right.
And they weren't named, but Nephi was among the 12.
Right.
So it makes sense.
Was a Nephi.
Yeah, his name was Nephi.
Right.
And he just said, I'm a Nephite. He said, I'm Brother Nephi.
Sorry.
And so that's how Mary Whitmer identified him as Brother Nephi. And it would make sense that it was Nephi because he was the senior one of those 12 disciples anyway. Yeah. So he would have been one of the 3 who asked to remain. And it's also interesting that
that's something you probably never heard before either until just now.
Yeah, most likely. Because unfortunately, well, we might as well address it.
Yeah.
The Saints book has a false account in it because they made up a dialogue in here that the guy said, my name is Moroni. And that's totally fictitious because in her own account, the only account she related, she said his name was Nephi.
Yeah.
And it was Edward Stevenson who was compiling church history who said, well, she must be wrong because it was Moroni that was in charge of the plates. So he changed it to say it had to be Moroni. But Mary said it was Nephi. And Brigham Young actually, his son went on a mission and he wrote him a letter to Brigham Young and he said, what's the deal between Nephi and Moroni? Because, here it says Nephi. Brigham said, don't worry about it. Both of them administered to Joseph Smith at different times. And so we know that tells us that this same Nephi, who was one of the 3 Nephites that gave the plates to Mary Whitmer, was the one who picked up the abridged plates from Joseph. And that fits with what...
would have been one of the 3 Nephites and so forth.
And that fits with what Brigham Young said about, don't worry if it was Moroni or Nephi, because he dealt with both of them. The other interesting thing about all this is David Whitmer described this guy, as we mentioned earlier, that he was an old man with a beard and 5'8" and all that. And Oliver Cowdery described Moroni as taller than the normal people in that age, and he was not old. He was glorious and all that. So you have two distinct people. David Whitmer even related conversations that he had with both of them, because when he met with Moroni as part of the three witnesses, Moroni warned him to remain faithful, words to that effect. So he had a conversation with Moroni, but he also had this conversation with Nephi on the side of the road, and he knew they were two different people, So there you go. That's just a crazy. One last thing on the two sets of plates that's interesting.
Yeah.
If you read the Joseph Smith history, Joseph said he returned the plates to the messenger by prior arrangement. Brigham Young said Joseph Smith returned the plates to the hill Cumorah. So that's an inconsistency until you realize they were talking about two different sets of plates. Joseph returned the plates he got from the repository, which were the abridged plates, returned those to the messenger.
Yeah.
But the plates of Nephi he took back to the hill Cumorah. So Joseph and Brigham were both correct. They were just talking about two different sets of plates. And that's just another fun detail about all this. Okay, so getting back to the Nauvoo Times and Seasons.
Times and Seasons, yes.
So Benjamin Winchester contributed these articles, and they were very influential, obviously, because they kicked off the whole Mesoamerican thing.
Yeah.
So should we look at the articles here now?
Let's roll with what I had before, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Called Traits of the Mosaic History. This article basically discusses the similarities between Baron Humboldt's volume of researches in Mexico and biblical accounts of Noah's flood, confusion of the language at the time of Babel that were reported there, and it states in the Times and Seasons, there are many things contained in the above that go to support the testimony of the Book of Mormon, as well as that of the Mosaic history. The Mexican records agree so well with the word of the Book of Ether in relation to the confounding of languages that we insert the following, and then they actually insert chapter 1 of Ether into the Times and Seasons. Here then we have two records found upon this continent that go to support the words of eternal truth, the Bible. And whilst these records, both of them, sanction the testimony of the Scriptures in regard to the flood, the Tower of Babel, and the confusion of languages, their tradition and hieroglyphics of the Zaltese, the Cohicans, and the Azteca nations in regard to the confusion of languages and their travels to this land is so like that contained in the Book of Mormon that the striking analogy must be seen by every superficial observer. These accounts then precisely agree, one of which was found in Ontario County, New York, and the other in Mexico. Again, those nations of families embody themselves together and traveled they know not where, but at length arrived in the county of Aztlan of the Lake County of America. The Book of Mormon says that the brother of Jared cried unto the Lord that he would give them another land. The Lord heard him and told him to go to a certain place. And there I will meet thee and go before thee into a land which is choice above all the land of the earth. This, it further speaks, is the land of America. The coincidence is so striking that further comment is unnecessary. Signed, E.D. A couple of quick questions about this. Did the previous account indicate that the Book of Mormon and the Humboldt volume are both about the same people? No, it was simply demonstrating that both the Book of Mormon and the Mexican records support the biblical accounts of Noah's flood and the Tower of Babel. The use of ED or editor was for use by those who had authorization as such. John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph Smith all appear to have been authorized to sign as editor based on their differing personal writing styles and word usage patterns. In other words, when they would write, they would use specific words, and they had certain patterns that they would write. And so articles that were signed ED, if you take a look at the linguistics, many times could be determined who it was that wrote those articles. And John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph Smith all had the editorial authorization to sign as such.
Let's stop right there. Okay.
In the Times.
Stop it there. Yep.
Okay, so back then.
This is where I was wrong.
Yeah, well, not necessarily wrong,
Well,
but not complete.
I didn't have the whole story.
You didn't know about
Yeah.
William Smith,
Yeah.
for one thing.
I mean, it is true that those three were, but what we didn't know is the rest of the
Yeah,
story.
and
that
we
you're
don't
telling
know
us
how
right now.
much they were involved, because Wilford Woodruff said he was involved with the business side of it.
There was a time when he was so sick that he didn't even show up for probably
Well,
a couple
him
of
and-
months.
yeah, that was a little later, but yeah,
Yeah.
after June. But I found, going through Wilford Woodruff's journal, I found a real interesting comment he made. And I think it was either in June or July, But he said, Joseph Smith is so busy, he hardly has time to sign the things we prepare for him. Right in his journal.
Well, let's just kind of, just for a second, what was Joseph Smith busy doing? I mean, he was running a city. He was the mayor of Nauvoo. Yeah. He was the head of the Nauvoo Legion. Mm-hmm. He was, in some cases, well, we're going to get into this, he was in hiding. Mm-hmm. He had been falsely accused of taking a pot shot at Governor Boggs.
Right.
He was managing his own affairs and his family.
Well, and he was overseeing the temple. He was organizing the Relief Society. He was selling land to people coming into town. Yeah. He and William had arguments about land and all. There's all kinds of stories, and it's
even helped John Bernheisel purchase a piece of property there.
Yeah, that was part of that. But so that's why when Wilford Woodruff said he didn't have time to even sign his name, much less write anything or edit something. They were preparing stuff for him to sign for the official documents,
But you get the impression from people who promote the Central American idea that he just had nothing better to do than to sit there and to set the type and do everything that was on the boilerplate of the Times and Seasons that he would, because if you look at the boilerplate, which will come up here in a minute, it says that basically Joseph Smith was doing everything. But they were doing that because they wanted to give credence to to honor Joseph Smith.
Kind of a stamp of authority.
A stamp of authority. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but so I wanted to bring up here because even if these others had editorial privileges, let's say, Joseph Smith didn't have the time to write articles or edit articles, and Wilford said he hardly had time to even sign his name.
Yeah.
And so, but this, the point earlier was that in your list of candidates here, those are the same three that Matt Roper had. Hadn't even considered William Smith or W.W.
It would have been fun to see Matt Roper actually put in, the stylometry of William and Benjamin Winchester and other people, and see how that actually played out.
He did do what he calls his stylometry for Benjamin Winchester, and said he didn't qualify either. And I said, okay, show me all the data that you used and the software, and I'll see if I can replicate your...
I think he got stonewalled, didn't he?
Yeah, he wouldn't do that. He did what I call black box analysis, where he comes up with his secret little formula and comes up with his results, but he didn't tell anybody what data he used or his methods or his software. In fact, he was doing a presentation at another one on his stylometry stuff, and the guy sitting next to me started laughing. And I said, "What's up?" And he goes, "This is completely bogus stuff. I know stylometry, and these guys aren't doing it right." And I never met this guy before, Yeah. And so, I mean, Matt's trying to do a good work, but in my view, his work on this topic has been just not credible at all. And so I suspect, and the reason he didn't share me what database he used for Joseph's writings, because he was using Benjamin Winchester's articles as if Joseph had written them, because they were signed by editor. But anyway, that's kind of water under the bridge.
That would completely skew the results if you assume that the things that were written by Benjamin Winchester were actually written by Joseph Smith, and that was your prime assumption.
Or vice versa, or someone else. And I pointed out in these books too that some of these articles, there's one called Try the Spirits, and you can see in there parts of it that were clearly from Benjamin Winchester, because he was writing the same material in his other books at the same time, but other parts were edited, and presumably by William or maybe John Taylor or someone else. And once you have multiple authors editing a document, the stylometry breaks down. So it's hard to be too precise about it. But we can see for sure, we know that Joseph didn't have time to be editing, much less writing these articles. We can see for sure, as you pointed out here, he didn't sign them. And we also know that there were more than Wilford Woodruff and John Taylor acting as editors, because William Smith was for sure. And probably Phelps was when he showed
I was
up.
relying on what I had been told by some other people from the Mesoamerican camp, actually, that those are the only three candidates. So that which makes sense, and corroborated by the fact that Roper actually only used those three as for the stylometry.
This has been the assumption since basically since Nauvoo time. That people just assume those three were the ones involved. So,
all right, so we go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
The season, this is still in this June 15th, 1842 edition, In several instances, the Times and Seasons had an article attributed to ED, or editor, and another article to Joseph Smith in the same issue, bearing the same statement on the end page that the Times and Seasons was edited, printed, and published by Joseph Smith. Well, certainly Joseph Smith did not fulfill all of these responsibilities personally, including the editing, for which he had previously already given the 12 the responsibility to do. When somebody says, well, the ED means it was Joseph Smith himself that did that, well, according to that editor end page, it means that it was edited, it says that it was edited, printed, and published by the prophet. And certainly Joseph Smith was not actually setting type and putting these things together. Only through Joseph Smith's attached personal signature, as he himself promised to do for all articles having my signature henceforward, can confidence be given that the article was in fact written by himself and not one of the other editors of the Times and Seasons. This article in July the 15th of 1842, called American Antiquities, discusses artifacts found in Marietta, Ohio, Nashville, Tennessee, Natchez on the Mississippi, some made of copper near Chillicothe, Ohio, others of silver found in Circleville and Marietta, Ohio. The article then quotes from the Book of Mormon regarding ores and concludes by mentioning mounds, fortifications, architecture, implements of war. In every case, the articles mentioned were found in North America. The article, without mention of any Mesoamerican archaeological artifacts, ends up with the unknown editor attaching Stephen's researches to the North American finds. The article was signed ED for editor. This is a quote from that article. If men in their researches into the history of this country, in noticing the mounds, fortifications, statues, architecture, implements of war, of husbandry, and ornaments of silver, brass, etc., were to examine the Book of Mormon, their conjectures would be removed and their opinions altered. Uncertainty and doubt would be changed into certainty and facts. Stevens and Catherwood's researches in Central America abundantly testify of this thing. The stupendous ruins, the elegant structure, and the magnificence of the ruins of Guatemala and other cities corroborate this statement and show that a great and mighty people, men of great minds, clear intellect, bright genius, and comprehensive designs inhabited this continent. Their ruins speak of their greatness. The Book of Mormon unfolds their history. Signed, E.D. Now, this is the Times and Seasons September 15th, 1842 article called Extract. And what happens in this article is that the editors put in a little portion from the Stevens Incidents of Travel in Central America book and then make some editorial comment about it afterwards. The foregoing extract has been made. We are sorry that we could not afford the expense to give the necessary cuts referred to in the original. Let us turn our subject, however, to the Book of Mormon, where these wonderful ruins of Palenque are among the mighty works of the Nephites, and the mystery is solved. Mr. Stevens' great developments of antiquities are made bare to the eyes of all the people by reading the history of the Nephites in the Book of Mormon. They lived about the narrow neck of land which now embraces Central America with all the cities that can be found. Now, this was an unsigned article, but in the writing style, the editors used the words we and our and so forth.
Okay, you gotta stop there for just a second. Go back to that, because I actually had that highlighted 15 years ago.
You did. That's
but
funny.
I don't even mention it in my video.
That's right.
Isn't that interesting?
That is really
15
interesting.
Years ago when
That's
we did
amazing.
that was right there.
Right out of Winchester's
I didn't even
newspaper.
realize that until just now.
I didn't either, because I just heard it. I didn't see it.
Anyway,
That's
that was
awesome.
awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
keep going. Sorry.
Type of writing that you will see that is different from when Joseph Smith actually writes the articles. This is a different article in the same September 15th, 1842 edition of the Times and Seasons. It's called Facts or Stubborn Things. From an extract from Stevens' Incidents of Travel in Central America, it will be seen that the proof of the Nephites and Lamanites dwelling on this continent, according to the account in the Book of Mormon, is developing itself in a more satisfactory way than the most sanguine believer in that revelation could have anticipated. It certainly affords us a gratification that the world of mankind does not enjoy. To give publicity to such important developments of the remains and ruins of those mighty people. When we read in the Book of Mormon that Lehi went down to the Red Sea to the great southern ocean and crossed over to this land and landed a little south of the Isthmus of Darien as a branch of the house of Israel, and then read such a goodly traditionary account as the one below, we cannot but think the Lord has a hand in bringing to pass his strange act and proving the Book of Mormon true in the eyes of all the people.
Let's stop there for a sec.
The extract book.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because we don't read in the Book of Mormon that they landed by the Straits of Darien.
Yeah. Where is that?
That's in Central America.
Yeah. But, I mean,
Basically
but where
Panama.
is it in the Book of Mormon? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not there.
It's not in the
It
Book
doesn't
of Mormon.
exist. Yeah.
So this is an editorial, what would you say, enhancement or something? Or delusion, you could say. But it reflects...
It's some editorial license.
Yeah, okay.
Would be the
editorial
correct
license.
word there.
But it was a common belief among the Pratt brothers and Benjamin Winchester that the Isthmus of Darien was the narrow neck of land.
Yeah.
But I've pointed out in other places that the phrase narrow neck of land and neck of land was used by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, other people involved with the Revolutionary War, for all these sites in New York specifically, as well as up in Boston. And they're small areas. It's not an isthmus of a continent.
Yeah.
And that's how the term was commonly used.
Well, and plus we know that in the Book of Mormon, it was said that a Nephite could cross the narrow neck of land, that particular one,
Yeah.
in a day's journey,
Yeah.
which limits it in size. I
As,
mean,
as long as we're talking about that, people always ask me, where's the narrow neck of land? And I always say Ether 1020. Because that's the only place in the Book of Mormon
Where it says
that refers to a narrow neck of land.
yeah, there's narrow passages and there's other narrow
Well,
places.
there's a narrow neck, but it doesn't say of land.
Yeah.
And there's a small neck.
We've just all assumed it's all the same
Yeah,
place. And
I know.
And it turns out that it doesn't make sense that they're all the same place.
Yeah, they use different terms, all these different terms for the same place. That doesn't make any sense. And it's also significant that it would specify a narrow neck of land, because often in geography people talk about a narrow neck as a waterway, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they said, no, this was a narrow neck of land, different from a narrow neck,
Yeah.
you know, so, and the small neck of land. So
And we'll get into all that.
That's a future
in
video.
another video when
Yeah.
we talk about the Phoenician and waterways and so forth in the
Yeah.
Book of Mormon.
But I just wanted to point that out because they say it was in the Book of Mormon, but it isn't in the Book of Mormon.